Begin. God is dead. A fire is burning, and I hear the boots of Lucifer, and I see his filthy face, and it is my face, and it is your face, Danforth. And God damns our sort especially, and we will burn together. In 1952, when Arthur Miller wrote those words for The Crucible, he dramatised and partially fictionalised the story of the Salem witch trials. And in this famous line, he refers to that Nietzschean idea that God is dead and that we have killed him. And in many ways, at that moment, Miller opened the floodgates for the use of religion and religious themes in drama, both to critique religion and to critique, in Miller's case, larger social issues. And while The Crucible is a lot more serious than The Vicar of Dibley, and any of the other shows that I want to dip in today, Miller's critique of Reds under the bed, the communist fear-mongering that was going on in the US at the time, which landed him in the court of un-American activities and ultimately in jail. And I very much doubt that Richard Curtis, who wrote The Vicar of Dibley, would receive the same flack. But I do want to suggest that today's TV comedies do as much to provide social critique as the theatre did in Miller's day, if maybe a little bit more subtly. And so even in comedy, priests and ministers and pastors are still being used to provide both social commentary and commentary on religion. And from our side, from the side of Christians and ministers, they can also give us a window into how our wider culture views us, how they view the church, how they accept us, and ultimately, I'd like to say, where they are willing to engage with us. Sometimes in the work that I do, as Melinda suggested, in community engagement, the church can behave a little bit like a small child standing at the edge of the school oval, wondering why no one wants to play. And I don't think it's the case. I don't think no one wants to play. But I do want to ask today if maybe sometimes we're holding a football and it's cricket season. And I think these shows can sometimes provide us with some insight into the thinking of where the wider culture wants to engage with us. So I've particularly chosen likeable priests for that reason. And I do still find the prevailing use of priests and ministers in drama and comedy quite interesting. Now, all of the comedies that I'm speaking about today have come out of the UK, which does have a lot stronger religious tropes in its history than we do in Australia. But I still find it interesting that in a post-Nietzschean, a post-religious society, it seems somewhat discordant that we're still, and screenwriters are still consistently relying on religious components within their work. If God is dead, then shouldn't his symbols be too? Then shouldn't his characters? And that's why I think this deserves a closer look, because I believe that they do communicate not just our culture's critique of religion, our culture's critique of the church, but also where our culture sees value in the church. And while I know that we don't want to become a puppet of social whim or to bend or to twist our faith in order to please the masses, because that doesn't sound a lot like Jesus, and while I think there is still a place for the unpopular prophet in society, I also believe that where social value meets gospel truth, we have a great opportunity to share the love of God with our wider communities. Basically, where their value meets our values, that's where we have a great space for conversation. And in this case, I think we can hear from the social commentaries of these shows that I want to talk about in at least three significant ways in which our culture is willing to engage with us. And therefore, this gives us an opportunity to be able to share our faith in a way that is meaningful for our wider culture, in a way that is accessible and a way that is valuable to them. It takes helpful truths and magnifies them as comedy does. And I would like us to end this session together working out how we can do that in some more practical ways. So the TV shows, I'm looking at the idea of priests and ministers in TV shows in general, but the focus that I'm going to provide is on 2 shows that are currently or very recently airing on Australian TV. And then I'm also going to include the Vicar of Dibley, because I do think that if you ask the average Australian to name a priest on TV, Geraldine would probably be, you know, the one that came up number 1 on the Family Feud list, so to speak. And then, having looked at these 3 shows, I want to pull out 3 themes that I think come out of these. So the 3 shows that I want to talk about, I feel like I've got more slides before this, but maybe I don't. Maybe I've just put it in. Alright, I've got the wrong PowerPoint, so that's always great. The 3 shows that I want to pull out of this are Father Brown, in which a village Catholic priest solves crimes by saving souls. The Vicar of Dibley, which is no doubt known to most of you, where a small rural town comes to terms with their first female priest. And probably the most recent incarnation, that still might be unfamiliar to some of you, but the BAFTA award-winning Rev, in which an Anglican reverend battles with poverty, politics and irreverence in inner city London. And while, like I said, these are all BBC shows with high church characters, the themes that I want to explore, I believe, translate to Australia and to low church settings too. And the first theme, as you can see, that I'd like to look at is that of the pragmatic priest. Because all 3 central characters, all the priests in these shows, are highly pragmatic people and arguably more concerned with practicalities than they are with piety. All 3 wrestle to a greater or lesser extent with the tug between realism and idealism. All 3 are placed also in contrast with more reverent and pious characters who come off more callous by comparison to their characters. Unable to turn anyone away from his pastoral care, the Anglican Vicar and Rev, Reverend Adam Smallbone, is faced with a series of moral challenges as he balances the needs of his genuine believers, people on the streets, drug addicts, as well as social climbers who are trying to use him to get their kids into the local Anglican school. While constantly conflicted as drug dealers come begging at his door and his church building is robbed and the building falls apart, Father Adam consistently puts the practical and the person in front of the rules. And he is put in contrast, and I had pictures of this in my updated slideshow, with the Archdeacon Robert, who represents a more political priest, more concerned with climbing the clerical ladder, with people's opinion and with style over substance. He uses piety to distance himself from people. Rev provides us therefore with 2 contrasting pictures of the church. Adam, who sees the whole person, the whole story, and who's willing to journey in messy ways. And this is put in contrast with Robert and Adam's 2IC Nigel, who both apply blanket piety over all people. It frequently begs the question of us, what is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? The pragmatic Jesus who admonishes the Pharisees that for all of their piety, if their child were to fall into a well on the Sabbath, they would do all work necessary to get that child out, pointing out that piety without pragmatism is ridiculous. And this is where these comedies show ministers in a really positive light, because they each choose practical piety over religious piety, and that is very refreshing to their community. And they engage in a way that is helpful, draws close to their people in practical ways. Likewise, the Vicar of Dibley, who's described in the British Comedy Guide as the jolly, down-to-earth female Vicar of Dibley, a small country town inhabited by oddballs, and after overcoming the town's initial shock at her gender, Geraldine helps to improve the village. Geraldine does indeed participate practically in every area of the community, not just in the parish and the preacher work. No task is too small for this vicar. I had a picture of this one, dressing up as the Easter Bunny to distribute eggs through the town and the request of a parishioner, or helping them to solve crossword puzzles in the middle of the night. Neither of these are too low for her. I think this encourages those of us who are ministers particularly, but for all Christians, that culturally we are invited to participate in our communities. Our communities want us to engage with them in everyday elements of life and not just in ritual, ceremony and services. And this is respected, especially when we are willing to take the less showy and more down-to-earth jobs. In fact, throughout the Vicar of Dibley and Rev, the only time that Geraldine and Adam are shown in a bad light is when they are seeking attention for themselves or trying to grow their own reputation, which inevitably fails. Father Brown is an even more classic example of this. He uses his distinctive skills and his close friends, as well as his wits, to solve crimes in classic BBC style. Think Miss Marple. Occasionally he does this, however, even to the neglect of his parish duties. His vocation as a priest shows him as someone who has insight into truth, so that justice, but not always the letter of the law, is served. He's likeable both because of his pragmatism to dogma and also to the law. But his greatest strength, both as a priest and as a detective of crime, is his love and understanding of other people. He is there not to judge, but to save souls. And he's put in contrast with Mrs. McCarthy, who's the church secretary, who again represents the church member most concerned with people's opinion and who considers Christian charity to be strawberry scones and tea. Too often I think we too can be tempted to play Mrs. McCarthy and turn hospitality into scones and tea in the church. And while I am very partial to a good scone with strawberries and double cream and a strong cup of tea, in case anyone was interested, the contrast between what Father Brown offers in terms of hospitality and what Mrs. McCarthy does is significant. While McCarthy puts on her tea and scones, Brown is busy with the true work of hospitality, of transforming people from outsiders to insiders. Now, while all three comedies contrast pragmatic priests against pious politicians, they likewise all cast very strong women of faith. Lady Felicia, who we can see on the side here, in Father Brown, stands up to and provides a stark contrast to the over-top political piety of Mrs. McCarthy. Felicia supports Father Brown and his rough sidekick Sid, especially in his more left-of-centre endeavours. In contrast, even to Father Brown, who can sometimes appear in a bit of a bumbling manner, Lady Felicia is calm and self-assured. Reverend Adam Smallbone is married to an equally self-assured Alex Smallbone, who, while she's always ready to support her vicar husband, has her own career as a lawyer in London and is frequently shown to be the strong and reliable character in the partnership. And of course, the Vicar of Dibley. Now, much of the way that the comedy in the Vicar of Dibley comes out of the way that French plays the female vicar, I think what's most significant to note is that Geraldine is never the figure you were meant to be laughing at. While she is funny, she's also likewise the calm centre around which all the chaos of comedy flows. And she responds to this chaos with humour. She's real, which we'll touch on more later, but she isn't a buffoon. The presentation of strong women in the church obviously is a recipe for comedy because it's not in line with our most recent history. And we must realise that for all we think that we've made large strides in addressing gender inequality in the church, the meek Christian wife, not the strong Christian leader, is how our society still believes the church views women. I can say from personal experience that when people find out that I'm an ordained person, they view this as a cheerful novelty. In fact, I received an email just this week. So lovely to meet you the other day, and I'm lovely surprised to see that you are a reverend and that the Baptist Church has diversity. So while we may think this internally, the rumour hasn't got out. And I often find that this surprise game actually gives me a nice opportunity to speak to other people about the church and faith. And yes, I do frequently get asked, oh, like the Vicar of Dibley. And it's not just women. People's view of the church, and especially the church that they don't want to engage with, is white, it's old, and its leadership is male. Interestingly, if we look to comedy and drama and theatre in general, African American churches are almost always shown in a positive light on the screen. As the first social institution that actually are allowed at total control of black Americans, they represent external power structures being inverted. And isn't that entirely in line with the person of Jesus, the person of God, coming in flesh, human flesh, to completely invert our power structures? So I would say that where we do surprise our communities by inverting power structures, by putting those who are culturally in less power at the head of the table, this is a positive thing. And I would like to suggest that we can do more to capitalise on that surprise, on surprising our communities where we do have diversity, by putting front and centre when we have the opportunity, our female leaders, our ethnic diversity, our Indigenous leadership, and by risking considering what leadership might look like from other marginalised groups. Where the church is portrayed as favourably in each of these stories, it's where it breaks down the traditional stereotypes of patriarchy and where it stands with those on the margins. The least respectable member of the parish council, Owen, is the first to speak up for Geraldine as the Vicar of Dibley. And of course, Geraldine herself is saintly in her humanity for putting up with all of these largely male patriarchal idiots around her. And you admire her for sticking with it. She's compassionate, she's articulate, but most of all, she cares deeply for these strange people around her. And despite his checkered and potentially criminal history, Sid in the Father Brown continues to be the most reliable ally to the priest. And Brown relies on him both to help him seek justice, but also as a friend. And with the character of Colin in Rev, we again meet a man with a checkered and potentially criminal history and present, really, who is shown to be the most colourful character and yet also the most consistent. Our culture is most willing to engage with us, where we're most willing to engage with the margins. And we do that as a church. We don't always do it well, but it is a part of our narrative. But more than just soup kitchens, the irreverent reverends of these comedies are friends with those characters who are colouring outside of the margins of life. Mother Teresa once criticised, "You say you love the poor, tell me their names." And of course, each of these characters, each of these priests could do that. So it only remains for us to ask, can we? And how do we demonstrate that to our communities? But perhaps, so powerless, priestess pragmatists, minority ministers, but perhaps above and beyond their compassion and friendship with the vulnerable and their practical application of their theology, there is one thing more appealing about these funny and endearing vicars than anything else, and that's their humanity. The bumbling, overweight, bicycle-riding character of Father Brown, sweating and breathless in the pursuit of justice. The doubting and faltering Reverend Smallbone, who struggles to keep his congregation in bread, let alone in church. And of course, the female vicar and her frequent colourful language and behaviour, which would usually be frowned on by the church. Much like the disciples of Jesus in the Gospels, these leaders are shown for all their strengths, but also for their failings. They're not above their people, they are with them. They're not above failing, but they're able to easily forgive because of it, because whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Faltering in their ambition, often faltering in their faith, they work on, for after all, as Geraldine's favourite passage of Scripture says, it is the weak who inherit the earth. All the way through my teens, I was convinced that naturally I would become a supermodel and then marry either Eric Clapton or David Soul, as you do. And then one day I read the Sermon on the Mount, and it was so fantastic, that was it. Our own Lord and Saviour Jesus was not above humility and not above humanity. Though he was in very nature God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, became human, he moved into the neighbourhood with us. And each of these characters does indeed move into the neighbourhood with people, participating in the muckiness of their daily lives, being willing to fumble and grow in their own faith and life alongside of them. So the question I want to ask today is, what does it mean for us to be pragmatic priests, minority ministers and powerless pastors, practically in our communities today? I want to ask, where are we already doing this and where could we be doing it better? So I have 3 questions that were meant to be on my slideshow, and I might have to write them up if we have a cardboard marker. Champion.
Teacher.
Yeah.
So where's Sophie when you need her? She always does that. So the first question I'd like us to explore is, so rather than you asking me questions, I'm wondering if you, in groups of 2 or 3, might actually have a look at that, and I've got 2 others.
Obviously, all stuff. Yeah. I didn't say so. There was that Chinese speaker. 3 weeks ago. Chinese sign for welcome. So that was actually quite hypnotic. Not saying this is not just me. This she's asking how. So he's got to make contact
with our church community.
Whichever you'd rather answer. I was going with local, but if I'm happy with either.
Like, how do we have conversations about having friendships?
Oh, so it's not just
How do we have conversations with our community about friendships?
So do we need to go on, sorry.
I'm guessing by community, it's like a wider community, so like, so how do we have...
Oh, yes, there is. There are people who are
Some
of the outcomes, misfits on the socially
about how we get
how do we raise awareness? Often it's the main character coming about that a large part of the story is focused around. It's about contradiction of these lost souls.
Could we clarify the first question?
Yes.
Can we just clarify the first question?
Yeah.
How do we have conversations with our communities? We're talking to the communities rather than the vulnerable first.
About how we are having friendship with the vulnerable. Yeah. Maybe I'll add a word there.
First we have to don't worry. I guess that's an instinct that I have to you know it like to not sort of boast about
Cool. Did I do it until? Did I do it in 20?
yeah.
25. Pretty close. Is that the closest? Do I get the jelly beans?
I said 25.
I thought it was something which one everyone said so far. It's totally fine.
Yes.
And we just got like a few different before, and after we got like 2 minutes.
Yeah. Let's
Do you have any ones like wanting to help in most other things?
Yeah, most people really enjoy it.
really.
Well, yeah, because it's not pop culture. Strong opinions on a lot of pop culture.
And like sometimes it invites other kinds. And I get it. Like went to you do Lord of the Rings, it's like club like saying, yeah, I care about this. I want to say,
I have an opinion on
it's a
this.
good one.
Yeah.
Because it's probably less people
Might not be
less.
sleeping in the street.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Less
everyone's
attached to
got
that. Well, yeah, but less people
Invested.
invested. Yeah, over
What's your self?
And it's not
What about your place?
because it just keeps coming back.
It's a couple of James made my PowerPoint look beautiful. The graphic designer last night, and I clearly didn't save it. It's on my computer. It's like, so I had pictures of all the characters because I thought, particularly with Red, wouldn't actually know what I'm talking about. But he borrowed my series. Have you seen it? Do you want to borrow? If you want to, if you liked it, there's kind of pressure. They are.
Because where is it about? I'm trying to think where I watched it.
I have no. SBS or? Oh, I have to have a look. I don't think I do, but I might do. James might have got it for me. I'll have a look.
New people.
Like I know
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's British, so it's probably 6.
Yeah, 6. I might have seen.
You might have seen both. Yeah.
I feel like I knew which ones.
Yeah, but that's probably because you're used to watching American.
Pentecostal church couples.
Yeah, the Pentecostal church.
Oh, sorry.
Have you seen that one?
I think so, yes.
No, I'm at Parkside. Are you preaching Village? Damn it.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the second time. It's true, Monday. And I finished it. On the plane, I clearly was much closer than I realised. Then I had half the plane trip, but I'm like, I haven't done anything else. Read the in-flight magazine. It's boring. I didn't like reading more. Is that it?
Well, no, I mean, do you want us to get maybe
Yeah,
the first question? So
Oh, no, I'm assuming they're looking at number 2 or 3.
get us to talk about it with
Yeah. Have we got?
Yes, we've got 5.
I'll give them one more minute then, and then I'll get people to feed it back.
I'm not misquoting you in my tweet, by the way. You said that's because it's actually good as on Twitter.
Oh, no, I can't remember what she said.
I think it's fine.
I like your tweet about. Wait, so we finally I saw the earlier one.
I'm just coming up with another name for community. Clearly we use community for church too
Use
often.
it for too many different things.
Because when I use it, I'm always talking about external, and then the amount of times I get answers back that they're internal, and I'm like, I need to come up with another word. So neighbourhood is often what Well, no, I tend to use community and congregation. But if I use community, people often use it for congregation.
Which tweet was
Talk about
to get some engagement
Yeah, I deleted my Twitter account. I'll tell you. I decided it was a black hole and I didn't need it anymore. So, but I deleted it before that suggestion that you sent out when you're like, engaged with it around the day of the girl. I'm like, I think I wrote back to him, I'm like, I have no Facebook wall. My Instagram is closed to like 20 people.
Is this what you said?
I'm sorry.
So I think the entire field saying no one wants to play with me, but we're holding a football and it's pretty much what he said.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I said.
It was actually the other one that was freely translated interpretation of what you said. I think the intention of that was like,
This is what you want.
Somehow,
this is what I said. Where the church is preferred for the comedy is where it's about having unexpected faces because of what you say. And by sending it marginalised, the church becoming it captures what you do.
Yeah. I would say that.
All those words in the
That's a good message. All right. Okay, I might just get some feedback from you on how you've answered, what sort of amazing conclusions you've come up with for this to resolve it as we finish up in the last minute. Did anyone have any points of gold, any nuggets that came out of that resolve in any of the 3 questions?
You've got some silver.
Bronze, mate.
Okay, give us your little your bronze nugget.
All of it. You see your stuff. Good.
Alright, so the main thing was when we were talking about how to have conversations. Oh, do I get a microphone? Yeah, I get a microphone. So the thing with about having conversations is if you just run around going, oh yeah, we're being friends with vulnerable people, people switch off. And so it's the difference between being open about something than running around slamming it in everyone's face. Kind of like be a lamp on a stand, let everyone see you. But if you get too close to the lamp or bring the lamp into someone's face, you're just going to set them on fire. And so it's sort of, you know, being open with it and not hiding it. But that doesn't mean you've got to run around and...
Make sure it's on the front page.
So it's got to exist.
Right, yeah. And I think that lines up very well with that idea of whenever they're trying to be self-promoting, all of the ministers come across terribly. But where they're just doing the work and being pragmatic, they come across well. So absolutely, yep.
We were discussing a point very similar to that in the sense that a lot of characters in these shows and in general TV, the ones that are making the difference are the ones that are located and are connecting with their small communities, are the ones that have settled down and are intimately interacting with everyone else, whereas the heroes, the so-called superheroes, they're out saving the world, but they don't save the people. They all get lost away in the carnage. But to save people and connect them and save their souls, really, you need to be settling with them. It needs to be a living and walking along with life with them.
Absolutely, brilliant. Thank you. Any other bits? Excellent. Well, thank you for participating in that. I appreciate it. And I'll hand back over to Melinda.
Thank